I stood there beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by 300 people dressed in silk and diamonds, while my own son introduced me as a family friend. The room fell into polite applause, and I smiled, because what else can a mother do when her child buries her alive? In shame, I had paid for every shimmering petal, every drop of champagne in that glittering hall, $650,000 from my own company's account. But no one knew. Not the guests, not the bride, not even the man pretending to be the groom's father. Yes, pretending. They'd hired an actor to play my late husband, claiming I had passed away years ago. And I let them. I sat quietly at table 18, near the kitchen doors where the smell of roasted duck drowned out my dignity until she arrived. The bride's mother, elegant, powerful, walked across the room, eyes locked on me. Her voice carried through the crowd. "Ms. Hughes, you're the CEO of Hughes Design Silence." Every head turned. Samantha's smile froze mid-laugh. My son turned white. That was the moment I stopped pretending too. By the end of that night, the music would stop, the lights would go out, and I would tear something worth more than their wedding apart with my own hands. But the betrayal had begun long before that day. My name is Margaret Hughes, but most people call me Maggie. I'm 62 years old, the founder and CEO of Hughes Designs, a high-end interior design company that serves clients from coast to coast. People see the tailored suits, the clean lines of my office, and the calm way I walk into a room, and they assume I've always been like this: composed, confident, successful. What they don't see are the years of paint-stained hands, sleepless nights, and the ache of building something from nothing. But that's the story I'm here to tell you. Because long before the wedding, the one where my own son would pretend not to know me, there was a time when I was nothing more than a young woman with a bucket of dreams and a handful of borrowed tools. I started Hughes Designs in the corner of our garage back when Daniel was still learning to ride a bike. My late husband, Paul, used to tease me about the smell of varnish clinging to my hair. "Maggie, you're going to turn this whole place into a workshop." He'd laugh, stepping over paint cans just to reach the refrigerator. But he believed in me. When clients canceled when bills came due and there wasn't enough to cover them, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "You're building something that will outlast us both." Then one morning, he didn't wake up. A heart attack, sudden, merciless at 48. I remember standing in the kitchen with Daniel, who was 15 then, and realizing that every safety net I thought I had was gone. The weeks that followed were a blur of casseroles, condolences, and quiet terror. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. The mortgage had to be paid, Daniel needed braces, and college was looming closer each year. I took on every project I could find. Small jobs at first, repainting the nursery for a neighbor, restoring an old dining table someone had nearly thrown away. Word spread, and slowly my name started to mean something. By the time Daniel graduated high school, Hughes Designs had grown beyond our small town. I'd landed my first corporate client, a boutique hotel in San Francisco. I remember walking into that meeting in a borrowed blazer, my portfolio clutched so tightly, my fingers went numb. The boardroom was full of men who looked like they'd been born into confidence, and there I was, the widow from Riverside, trying to talk about texture palettes and lighting symmetry. When the presentation ended, there was a long silence. Then the hotel owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Lorraine, smiled. "You have an instinct," she said. "It's rare. That one project changed everything. The money from it paid off our mortgage. The press from it opened doors." Within 5 years, Hughes Designs became one of the top luxury design firms in California. By then, I had offices, employees, contracts with developers and architects. I'd built my reputation not with charm or pedigree, but with precision and honesty. Still, I never forgot where I came from. I still drove my old sedan for years after I could afford better. I still made sure my team sent thank you notes handwritten, not emailed. To me, success meant being the kind of person Paul would still recognize if he walked through the door. Daniel, though, he saw success differently. As Hughes' designs grew, so did the distance between us. When he was younger, he used to sit beside me, sketching designs, asking questions about color and proportion. But as he got older, the sketches turned to spreadsheets, and the questions shifted to money. Mom, he'd say, you need to think bigger. You could expand, franchise, sell. I didn't want to sell. I didn't build this company to flip it. I built it so my son would have something solid beneath his feet. He did well in school, earned a degree in finance, and joined a private equity firm in Los Angeles. I was proud of him truly. But each time I visited, I noticed how quickly he'd steer the conversation away from me when his friends asked what I did. She runs a design business, he'd say vaguely, as if the word business made it more respectable than decorating. I'd laugh it off, pretending not to notice the small cracks forming between us. I suppose that's how mothers lose their sons, not in arguments or slammed doors, but in the quiet way pride starts to shift into shame. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. I loved him enough for both of us. When I turned 60, the local paper ran a feature on women who built their own empires. They called me the visionary of Hughes' designs. I framed the article and sent Daniel a copy. He never mentioned it. Months later, I saw it folded inside a drawer in his apartment under a pile of unopened mail. But I didn't stop believing in him. If anything, I worked harder. Every late night, every new contract, every award I accepted, I told myself it was for Daniel. For the day he would finally see me, not as a burden to hide, but as a mother to be proud of. I imagined the moment he'd stand beside me and say, "This is my mom, she built all of this." I never imagined he'd one day stand before 300 people and call me a family friend. At 62, I thought I'd reached the calm part of life, the season where the storm's quiet, and you finally get to rest in what you've built. But life has a way of testing the foundation, even of the strongest walls. I had built an empire from dust, from grief, from nothing but determination and love. I built it for him, but he was about to erase me from it. I didn't know it then, of course. At that time, life felt steady, almost peaceful. Business was thriving. I'd just opened a second showroom in Los Angeles. My days were full of meetings, client calls, and design reviews, the kind of quiet busyness that makes you believe you're in control. Daniel and I spoke less than I wanted, but often enough to convince myself we were fine. He'd call on Sundays, usually while driving somewhere, his voice distracted but polite. I took whatever I could get. I told myself that distance was normal, that sons grow up, fall in love, build lives of their own. I didn't know how literal that would become. It was early spring when Daniel called with the news. His tone was different. Lighter, excited, almost boyish. "Mom," he said, "I have something to tell you." I proposed. "Her name's Samantha." She said yes. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. My son, the little boy who once made forts out of my fabric samples, was getting married. My first reaction was joy, pure and simple. I congratulated him through tears, and he laughed. "You're going to love her," he said. "She's amazing." In that moment, I believed him. When I met Samantha a few weeks later, she was everything a mother hopes her son will find, at least on the surface. She was beautiful, articulate, polished in that effortless way that comes from being born into privilege. The Reynolds family was well known in California. Her father had passed, but her mother, Eleanor, was still a force in real estate and society circles. They lived in a world of fundraisers, private clubs, and long lunches in Napa. It wasn't a world I belonged to, but I was proud Daniel did. He seemed so happy, so sure. I remember watching him look at her during dinner, the way his eyes softened. I thought, she must be special to make him smile like that again. When Samantha reached across the table and said, "I hope we can plan something elegant but meaningful," I felt a spark of warmth. "Then it's settled," I said. "I'll take care of the wedding," she blinked. "Oh no, Mrs. Hughes, that's too much." But Daniel interrupted her. "Mom, are you serious?" "Of course," I said. "A mother gets to give her son one wedding in her lifetime. Let me make it beautiful." I could see relief in Samantha's eyes, a subtle, flickering kind of relief. At the time, I thought it was gratitude. Later, I'd realize it was something else entirely. Within days, I was on the phone with event planners, florists, and venue coordinators. Rosewood Estate in Napa Valley was the obvious choice. It had sweeping vineyards, crystal chandeliers, and a guest list capacity large enough to hold their combined worlds of business associates and friends. The cost was staggering $650,000 when all was said and done. But to me, it wasn't just money. It was love made tangible. I told no one, not even Daniel, exactly how much it would be. I handled everything through Hughes Designs using my company's accounts to manage payments. It was simpler that way. Event firms already knew our reputation, and I didn't want Daniel or Samantha to feel burdened by the details. Besides, I wanted to surprise them to show them that elegance didn't have to come from old money, that a woman who once sanded furniture in her garage could create something grand enough to rival any estate wedding. When the contracts were finalized, I drove to Daniel's apartment in Los Angeles with a folder of mood boards and sample fabrics. I still remember the look on his face when I showed him the layout, the floral arches, the glass marquee, the golden table settings. He smiled politely, but his enthusiasm didn't match mine. "It's impressive, Mom," he said. "But are you sure this isn't too much?" "It's your wedding," I said. "There's no such thing as too much love." He nodded, but something in his expression tightened, a hesitation, a flicker of unease that I brushed aside. I thought it was just the pressure of planning or maybe nerves about the marriage. I didn't realize that was the first hairline crack in the foundation. The first moment he started to pull away from me, not out of independence, but embarrassment. Still, I pressed on. I met with Samantha's mother once over lunch to discuss coordination. Eleanor was poised, confident, the kind of woman who could command a room without raising her voice. She complimented my taste, asked polite questions about my business, and mentioned how lovely it was that Daniel had someone so accomplished in the family. It was a simple comment, but it warmed me. For the first time, I felt like I might truly be welcomed into their world. I threw myself into the preparations. Every decision felt like a gift. The lace on the tablecloths, the champagne color of the bridesmaids' dresses, the faint scent of lavender woven into the centerpieces. I imagined the moment Daniel would see it all and realize what I had done for him, that I thought would be enough. That would make him proud. But there were small things that unsettled me, moments that didn't quite fit. When I asked about the guest list, Daniel said vaguely, "Samantha's handling most of it." When I offered to host a small engagement dinner, Samantha hesitated before declining, saying her family already had something planned. Once, when I mentioned my name to the venue coordinator, she frowned and said, "Oh, aren't you with the Hughes Designs Group? The payments came through under your company, right?" Robert Hughes. Robert Hughes. I assumed it was a clerical error. After all, there was no Robert Hughes, not anymore. My husband had been gone for over a decade. I went home that evening unsettled but unwilling to dwell on it. I told myself there would be time to ask later, time to understand. I didn't yet realize that what I had built with love was already being rewritten in their story, with my name erased, my place replaced. But the first sign of betrayal came even before the wedding. At first, I didn't see it for what it was. Daniel called one afternoon, and told me there was going to be a small dinner with Samantha's parents. "Just casual," he said. "You don't have to worry about anything fancy, Mom. It's really just for them to get to know me better before the big day." His tone was easy, reassuring, and I felt relieved. It had been months since we'd had any real time together, and I was looking forward to meeting Eleanor again, perhaps deepening that early warmth we'd shared. I offered to bring a bottle of wine from my collection, something aged and special, but Daniel chuckled. "No need, Mom. They're pretty simple people when it comes to that stuff." It was the way he said it, simple people, that made me pause. Eleanor Reynolds was anything but simple. I'd seen her at charity events, always perfectly composed, her hair immaculate, her pearls genuine. But I brushed it off. Maybe he was just nervous. Maybe he wanted me to feel comfortable. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday at the Huntington House, an upscale restaurant in Sonoma County. I told Daniel I'd meet them there, but he insisted it wasn't necessary. "They really just want it to be the couple and the parents," he said. "We'll do a bigger family dinner later. You can meet everyone then." His words were soft but firm, and something inside me folded. It had been years since he'd asked me not to come to something. When he was a teenager, I used to fight back, insisting that mothers belonged at their sons' milestones. But this time, I let it go. I didn't want to embarrass him. That Saturday, I found myself pacing the living room, wondering how it was going. I even set the table for one just to have something to do. I imagined Eleanor asking about my company, maybe teasing Daniel about inheriting my drive. I pictured Samantha smiling, proud of the family she was marrying into. It was a good image, warm and hopeful. The next morning, Daniel called. His voice was bright, maybe too bright. "Dinner went great, Mom. They loved me. Eleanor's incredible. She's already talking about how much she likes me for Samantha." "That's wonderful," I said. "I hope you mentioned me. I'd love to invite them over sometime, maybe for brunch." There was a pause. Just a breath too long. "Yeah," he said finally. "Of course I did." Then he changed the subject. I should have noticed how flat his tone became when I said invite. I should have paid attention to the silence between words. But love has a way of dulling the edges of suspicion. You want to believe your child is good. You want to believe you've raised him better than that. 2 days later, I received an unexpected email from the wedding coordinator. It was a summary of vendor updates and payment confirmations, nothing unusual. But there at the bottom of the thread was a forwarded invitation from Eleanor Reynolds to Mr. Robert Hughes. I frowned. My husband's name had been Paul, not Robert. Maybe it was another mix-up, like the billing error earlier. Still, curiosity tugged at me. I clicked open the invitation. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds request the pleasure of your company at the Huntington House to celebrate the engagement of Samantha Reynolds and Daniel Hughes." My stomach tightened. I read it again. It wasn't a casual dinner. It was an engagement dinner. Formal attire, champagne reception, family introductions. The kind of event where names are spoken with pride. I tried calling Daniel, but he didn't answer. Later, when he finally returned my call, he sounded tired. "Mom, please don't overthink it," he said. "It was just a dinner. Samantha's mom is traditional, that's all. There's nothing to worry about." But I did worry. For nights, I turned it over in my mind. Who was Robert Hughes? Why hadn't I been there? Why did he sound so defensive? The truth didn't reach me until weeks later, and when it did, it came by accident. I was on a site visit in San Francisco, checking on a hotel redesign, when one of my vendors, a caterer I'd recommended to Daniel, mentioned seeing him. "Your son's charming," she said. "He came in with his fiancée and his father. Lovely man, very dignified." "My son's father passed away years ago," I said quietly. She blinked. "Oh, then who was that?" He said his name was Robert. I thanked her and excused myself, but the words followed me all the way to my car. My hands were shaking as I sat there trying to make sense of it. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, in some corner of my heart, I knew. I drove home that evening in silence, the road a blur of headlights and doubt. The next day, I received a photograph from a mutual acquaintance who'd attended the dinner. There was Daniel, standing beside Samantha, his hand on her waist, smiling as if the world were perfect. To his right stood a man I had never seen before. Tall, silver-haired, well-dressed, his arm casually around Daniel's shoulder. The caption beneath the photo read, "The Hughes family looking wonderful together, the world tilted slightly on its axis." In that single moment, I understood everything. My son hadn't just left me out, he had rewritten me, erased me. In his story, I was gone. Dead even. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, the photo still glowing on my phone screen, and listened to the steady hum of the city outside. Somewhere Daniel was out there, living the life I'd built for him under a name I no longer recognized. That night, my son buried me with his lies while I was still alive. For days after that realization, I moved like a ghost through my own home. The walls that once echoed with laughter and work felt heavy with silence. My studio sat untouched. Sketches lay scattered across the drafting table, curling at the edges. I tried to lose myself in work, anything to keep from thinking. But every project, every invoice, every signed contract carried his name in some small way. Daniel Hughes. My son. The boy I'd built my world around. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the man in the photograph wasn't what it looked like. Maybe the dinner wasn't what I thought. Love, I've learned, can make you rewrite the truth just long enough to survive it. The wedding was only a few weeks away, and I kept planning as if nothing had changed. There were still vendors to confirm design details, to finalize linens to approve. The florist called one morning to ask about the arrangement substitutions. I said yes to everything she suggested without hearing a word of it. When we hung up, my email pinged with a new message from the wedding planner. The subject line read, "Final payment confirmation, Rosewood Estate wedding." I opened it automatically. It was routine by now. These confirmations another piece of proof that everything was under control. The message was short and polite. Payment received in full from Hughes Designs Group via Robert Hughes. Thank you for your continued partnership. For a long moment, I couldn't make sense of the words. My eyes went back to that line via Robert Hughes. The name seemed to pull the air out of the room. There it was again. Robert, the ghost of a man who'd never existed in my family, now apparently signing checks in my company's name. I read the email 3 times, convinced I was misreading it. Maybe a clerical error. Maybe the accountant used the wrong name. My mind reached for logic, for order, for something that made sense. But as I sat there at my desk, the glow of the computer screen painting the room in pale blue light, the edges of the truth began to form. Someone had used my company account, my name, my business to pay for that wedding, and they had done it under a false name, under a man's name. Robert Hughes. I thought of Daniel, of his easy tone when he told me everything was fine, of how quickly he changed the subject when I asked about the dinner. The puzzle pieces began to click together in ways I didn't want them to. It wasn't just a lie anymore. It was a rewriting of me. But still, I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Instead, I printed the email, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer beneath the company's tax forms, out of sight, but not forgotten. Then I picked up the phone and called Daniel. "Everything going okay with the wedding?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He sounded distracted, almost impatient. "Yeah, everything's great, Mom. Samantha's handling most of it now. You don't need to stress. I'm not stressed, I said quietly. Just making sure you're happy. He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. I'm fine, Mom. Really, don't overthink things. When we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring out the window. The city moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars humming down the street, sunlight sliding across the neighboring buildings. But something inside me had shifted. I could feel it. A small, quiet fracture running through the center of everything I'd built. I should have demanded answers. I should have called the planner, the vendors, the accountants. But I didn't. I told myself it didn't matter who signed the payments as long as Daniel and Samantha were happy. That was what mothers were supposed to want, happiness for their children, even at the cost of their own peace. So I kept preparing. I approved the seating arrangements. I ordered a gown, a simple navy dress with a modest neckline and a pearl clasp at the back. Not extravagant, but elegant. Appropriate for the mother of the groom. When the tailor pinned the hem, she said, "Your son must be so proud to have a woman like you." I smiled, though my throat ached. I hope so, I said. As the days passed, I rehearsed what I would say at the wedding, how I would introduce myself to Samantha's family. I imagined Daniel standing beside me, proud, confident, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I saw us laughing together, a family united by love and effort and everything we'd overcome. It was a beautiful picture, one I held on to even when logic whispered that it wasn't real. I needed to believe there was still good in him, that he hadn't meant to hurt me, that somehow this was all just a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. When the wedding planner called to confirm the final head count, I hesitated before giving her my answer. She mentioned again how smoothly everything had gone, how generous Mr. Hughes had been in handling the last transfer. "Mr. Hughes," I repeated softly, as if tasting the words could make them real. "Yes," she said. "Such a pleasure to work with. Everything's first class." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in the quiet for a long time. The air felt heavy, full of unspoken things. I looked around my office at the framed photos, the awards, the blueprints pinned to the wall. My name was everywhere. And yet, in the story being written for that wedding, I no longer existed. I straightened the papers on my desk and whispered to no one. "It's fine. It's all fine." But even as I said it, the words felt hollow. Hope, after all, can make fools of even the strongest hearts. Hope can be the cruelest lie we tell ourselves. I told myself that the morning of the wedding, as I stood before the mirror fastening the clasp of my pearl necklace, it had been Paul's gift to me on our 10th anniversary. Simple, timeless. The kind of thing that belonged to another life. The reflection staring back looked calm, maybe even dignified. But beneath that stillness was a heart that wouldn't stop racing. I had convinced myself that today would be the day everything made sense, that all the unease, all the unanswered questions would dissolve the moment Daniel saw me walk through those doors. The car ride to Napa was quiet, the road lined with vineyards stretching endlessly under the California sun. Rosewood Estate appeared at the end of a long, winding drive, its white stone facade glowing against the hills. It was breathtaking, exactly what I'd envisioned when I first began planning months ago. Rows of white roses framed the grand entrance, a string quartet played softly on the terrace, and guests in shimmering gowns and tuxedos laughed beneath cascading chandeliers. I parked farther from the main entrance, away from the valet line of black sedans and luxury cars. My old blue sedan looked like it had taken a wrong turn into someone else's story. Still, I smoothed my navy dress and stepped out, head held high. I had built this day, every detail of it. Whatever had gone wrong before today would be different. Inside, the air smelled of jasmine and expensive perfume. Waiters floated past with champagne trays, their movements practiced and silent. The room glittered alive with people who belonged to the world Daniel had always wanted, sleek, confident, born into comfort. I searched for him among the crowd, expecting that bright smile, the one that used to light up his whole face when he saw me. When I finally spotted him near the head of the room, he looked radiant in his tuxedo, his arm draped lightly around Samantha's waist. She was stunning, her gown an ocean of silk and lace, her hair swept into a perfect chignon. She moved like she owned the air around her. I wanted to be proud. I wanted to be happy for them both. Samantha noticed me before Daniel did. Her eyes flickered across the room and landed on me. For the briefest moment, something flashed in them, recognition, hesitation, but it was gone in an instant. She turned to a woman beside her, laughed softly, and looked away as if I were no one at all. My stomach tightened. I told myself she must not have seen me clearly. There were so many people. Perhaps she thought I was another guest. I began to make my way closer, weaving through clusters of guests, smiling politely when people glanced my way. Most of them didn't recognize me, and why would they? In this crowd, I wasn't the CEO of Hughes Designs. I was just an older woman in a modest dress, clutching a small silver purse, too simple for the occasion. When Daniel finally turned, his expression shifted. For a heartbeat, I thought he might come to me, might smile, might say the word, "Mom," the way he used to. Instead, his eyes darted toward Samantha, then back to me. A flicker of unease crossed his face before he smoothed it away. "Daniel," I said softly, reaching out a hand. He smiled that same polite, practiced smile I'd seen him use in business meetings. "Mom, Maggie, you made it." The name stung, even though I told myself it was nothing. "Maggie. Not Mom, I wouldn't miss it," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "Everything looks beautiful." "Yeah," he said, glancing toward the band. "It turned out great. Listen, there are so many people here tonight. I might not get much time to talk, but I'm glad you're here." I nodded. "I understand." I wanted to hug him to tell him how proud I was, but something about his posture stopped me. He was distant, his shoulders stiff, his eyes darting around as if hoping someone else would interrupt. That someone came in the form of the wedding coordinator who called him toward the stage for introductions. He took Samantha's hand and together they turned to face the guests. I found an empty seat near the back next to an older couple chatting about stock prices. From there I could see everything, the lights, the champagne tower, the smiles. Daniel's voice carried clearly over the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this special day. It means the world to Samantha and me to have all of you here." He went on to introduce members of Samantha's family, her elegant mother Eleanor, who waved graciously, her cousins and aunts and uncles. Then he moved to his own side, and from my side, he set his tone lighter. "I'd like to introduce some very dear people in my life." I straightened, waiting for it, waiting for him to say my name. He gestured toward a group near the front. My colleagues from Harrington Investments. Laughter and applause followed. And a special family friend who's been so supportive to both of us, Maggie Hughes. The room turned polite applause rising like distant rain. For a moment, I thought I might have misheard him. Family friend. The words echoed through me, quiet and cruel. Samantha smiled sweetly, her eyes sliding past me, as though she were looking through glass. Around her, guests nodded and smiled in my direction the way people do when they don't know what else to do. I forced a smile, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I felt the sting of tears but blinked them away. This was his day, I reminded myself. Maybe he'd said it that way to make things simpler to avoid confusion. Maybe this wasn't what it seemed. But when Daniel's gaze met mine again, it wasn't apology I saw there. It was relief. The quartet began playing again, guests resumed their chatter, and I sat perfectly still, my smile frozen in place. I told myself to breathe, to stay composed, to survive the evening. I could do that much. And then I saw him, the man they said was my husband. At first, my mind refused to make sense of it. He stood near the stage, shaking hands with Daniel's groomsmen as if he'd known them all his life. The man was tall, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit that fit him too perfectly to be borrowed. He carried himself with practiced ease, the kind of composure that comes from a life of pretending to belong everywhere. I watched as he adjusted his tie, smiled toward the guests, and stepped into the golden light pooling across the marble floor. I thought I must be mistaken, that maybe he was a distant relative of Samantha's or a friend of Eleanor's. But then Daniel turned beaming and gestured toward him with the microphone. And of course, my son said, his voice confident, I'd like to introduce my father, Robert Hughes. The room filled with applause. For a moment, I couldn't move. My breath caught shallow and sharp. It was as if the air itself had been pulled out of the hall. The name echoed through the chandeliers, through the laughter and the polite clinking of glasses, until it settled inside me like a stone. Robert Hughes. Every head turned toward the man now climbing the short steps onto the stage. His smile was warm, disarming, even charming. He waved modestly, a small gesture that made people like him instantly. I could see why Daniel had chosen him. He looked believable, distinguished, kind, the sort of man people picture when they imagine a steady father figure. Eleanor Reynolds stood and reached out to him as he descended the stage. "It's wonderful to finally meet you," she said, her voice rich with sincerity. "Daniel speaks so fondly of you. You must be so proud of your son." The man gave a polite chuckle. "Immensely," he said. "He's everything I ever hoped for." Something inside me cracked. The words should have come from Paul's mouth years ago, or from mine. But hearing them now, spoken by a stranger wearing my husband's ghost, felt like a theft. Not just of my place in that room, but of my entire life story. I tried to stand, but my knees refused to cooperate. My hands trembled against the tablecloth. Around me, guests smiled, toasting to the happy couple. Champagne glasses caught the light like tiny suns. I felt invisible sitting there among them, watching my family being rewritten before my eyes. The man, Robert Mason, I realized, with a sickening jolt, moved easily through the crowd. He shook hands, posed for photos, even offered a short, heartfelt speech about family love and the joy of seeing his son find happiness. Each word was a knife, smooth and deliberate. He didn't know me, but he was erasing me with every syllable. When he stepped down from the microphone, Daniel clapped him on the back, pride gleaming in his eyes. Samantha leaned in, kissing Daniel's cheek, whispering something that made them both laugh. The photographer called for a family photo, and I watched as they arranged themselves neatly, Daniel, Samantha, and Robert Hughes in front of the floral arch I had designed. My design. My flowers. My money. I wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, to tear through the polite fiction they had built. But all I could do was sit still the way you do when you're standing in a room full of fire and pretending not to feel the heat. At one point, a young server paused beside my table and offered a glass of water. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. I forced a smile. "I'm fine, thank you." My voice didn't sound like mine. Across the room, Daniel's laughter rang out again. For a heartbeat, I thought he looked my way, but if he did, his eyes slid right past me, landing on someone else. That hurt more than anything else that he could pretend I wasn't there, even as I sat less than 20 feet away. The evening blurred after that. Speeches, music, the rustle of silk and applause. Every sound felt distant, muffled by the roar inside my chest. I couldn't stop staring at the man who now carried my family's name, smiling in photos that would one day fill their albums. When it was finally time for dinner, the guests drifted toward the long banquet tables. My place card, I noticed, was near the back table 18, close to the kitchen doors. The scent of roasted lamb and garlic floated through as servers hurried in and out. I sat alone, hands folded in my lap, pretending to check my phone, while laughter echoed across the hall. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe there was a reason for all this, that Daniel would find me, later pull me aside, explain it all. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. My son had chosen this version of his life, a version without me in it. When the lights dimmed for the first dance, I watched Daniel lead Samantha onto the floor. Her gown shimmered like starlight. They moved in perfect rhythm, his hand resting lightly against her back. The crowd sighed, charmed, unaware that the woman who had built this night from the ground up was sitting in the shadows, watching her own erasure unfold. My hands curled into fists beneath the tablecloth. My name, Maggie Hughes, felt like a whisper, swallowed by the noise around me. They had buried me once in words and lies. But as I sat there in the dim light, something hard and steady began to rise inside me, a quiet, unshakable resolve. They buried my name once. This time I was going to dig it back up. But resolve doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits quiet, patient simmering just beneath the surface. I told myself to stay calm, to sit through dinner, like any other guest, to keep the dignity they had tried so hard to strip from me. Yet the longer I sat at table 18, the harder it became. The sounds of laughter, the glimmer of chandeliers, the clinking of crystal glasses, all of it pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shrug off. From where I sat, I could see Daniel and Samantha at the head table. They looked perfect, like two people pulled straight from a magazine spread. He was smiling again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. She was radiant, glowing under the soft amber lights, nodding gracefully as guests leaned in to flatter her. I watched as Eleanor, Samantha's mother, reached over now and then to rest a hand on Samantha's arm, a gesture of affection that twisted like a knife. I used to do that for Daniel when he was small. A waiter placed a dish of roasted duck in front of me. The aroma was rich, but I couldn't eat. My stomach was tight, my pulse sharp against my wrist. I thought about walking out, slipping away unnoticed. But I hadn't spent a lifetime building something only to vanish quietly again. No, I would stay. I would look my son in the eye and I would remind him who I was. When the speeches ended and conversation resumed, I gathered my courage and stood. My knees wavered slightly, but I steadied myself. Crossing the ballroom felt like walking against the current. People's heads turned their eyes, lingering just long enough to remind me I didn't belong here. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I made my way toward the head table. Samantha noticed me first. She was in the middle of a conversation with one of Daniel's colleagues, her laughter lilting and effortless. When her eyes met mine, her expression didn't change. She turned her head slightly, just enough to signal to the man beside her that she wasn't finished speaking. It was deliberate, controlled, the kind of social dismissal that leaves no room for dignity to breathe. I stopped beside Daniel's chair, waiting for him to turn. "Daniel," I said quietly. He flinched at the sound of my voice. Just a flicker, but enough to tell me he'd been hoping I wouldn't come. Slowly, he looked up, his eyes darting nervously toward Samantha before settling on me. "Mom," he murmured so low only I could hear. I forced a smile. I just wanted to tell you how beautiful everything looks. You and Samantha. You've done wonderfully. He gave a tight nod. Thank you, Mom. I'm proud of you. I added the words, trembling before I could stop them. For a moment, something human flickered across his face, a trace of the boy who used to draw beside me on the living room floor. Then it vanished, replaced by the polite mask he'd worn all evening. Mom, please, he whispered, leaning closer. Don't make a scene. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because of their harshness, but because of the quiet finality in them. There was no anger, no argument. Just a boundary cold, absolute, and unmovable. I straightened my shoulders. I wasn't planning to, I said, softly. Samantha turned then, offering me a smile so fragile it was nearly invisible. Maggie, she said smoothly, her tone the kind people reserve for distant acquaintances. I'm glad you could come. It means a lot to Daniel. I wouldn't miss it, I replied, though my voice felt far away, as if someone else were speaking through me. Before I could say more, she glanced back at her companion and resumed her conversation, her laughter floating lightly through the air. Daniel looked down at his plate. I waited a moment longer, hoping he might look up, might say something, anything. But he didn't. I turned and walked back toward my table, each step heavier than the last. I could feel eyes on me, though no one said a word. By the time I reached table 18 again, my hands were trembling. I sat down, pressing them against my lap until the shaking stopped. The servers had begun clearing plates. Someone at a nearby table laughed too loudly at a joke I didn't hear. The music shifted into something soft and slow, and couples began to drift toward the dance floor. From my seat, I watched Daniel take Samantha's hand again. She leaned into him as he whispered something in her ear, and for a moment, they looked like the picture of love itself. But I saw it differently now. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes avoided mine even from across the room. I saw Samantha's possessive hand on his arm, the subtle way she pulled him closer, as if to stake her claim on everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to hate them both. But what I felt was something colder, heavier. Pity, maybe, because I knew what it cost to build a life on lies. I sat back and let my eyes drift over the glittering crowd. They didn't see me, not really. To them, I was just another nameless guest tucked away near the kitchen, forgotten by the story unfolding in front of them. But I had lived long enough to know that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep people try to bury it. I reached for the glass of water in front of me and lifted it slowly, watching the reflection of the chandelier ripple across its surface. Somewhere in that glittering room, the first crack in their perfect facade was already forming. But fate doesn't hide forever, and neither do secrets. It began quietly the way most turning points do, without fanfare, without warning. I was still at table 18, half listening to the hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware, when I saw Eleanor Reynolds rise from her seat near the front. She was elegant, even in the smallest motion, her gown a deep shade of emerald that shimmered under the chandeliers. She moved gracefully through the room, stopping now and then to greet guests with that warm, commanding poise of hers. I assumed she was making her rounds, being the gracious hostess she always seemed to be. Then halfway across the ballroom, her gaze drifted in my direction. For a moment, I thought she was looking past me. People rarely looked at table 18 for long, but her expression changed. She froze mid-step, her smile faltering ever so slightly. I felt it before I understood it. The shift in energy, the slight hush as conversations near her paused. Her eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in recognition. She took another step forward, then another, and suddenly she was walking straight toward me. At first, I didn't move. Maybe part of me didn't believe it. Maybe part of me was afraid to. But as she came closer, I could see it clearly now, the flicker of certainty in her expression, the dawning awareness of who I was. When she reached my table, she stopped and extended her hand with a look of genuine surprise and something else. Respect. "Ms. Hughes," she asked, her voice carrying easily through the chatter of the room. "You're the CEO of Hughes Designs, aren't you?" The sound of her words rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water. The tables nearest us fell silent. First, then the next and the next, until the music itself seemed to fade. Every head turned. For a few seconds, no one spoke. No one even breathed. I stood slowly because somehow that felt right. I didn't stammer or deny it. I didn't shrink. I simply nodded once. "Yes," I said softly. "I am." Eleanor's face lit with astonishment. "My goodness," she said, glancing around the room. "I didn't realize you were here tonight. We've never had the pleasure of meeting, but I know your company's work. It's exquisite. You're practically a legend in Napa design circles." Her tone was warm, even admiring, and that, ironically, was what drew every pair of eyes in the room to me. Guests began to whisper, their faces flickering with curiosity. They looked from me to Daniel to Samantha, to the man still seated beside them, the imposter, with my husband's stolen name. Samantha's smile vanished. Her posture stiffened, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass until I thought it might shatter. Daniel's color drained. He tried to recover, but there was no saving this moment. The truth had walked into the room uninvited and undeniable. I watched them both, letting the silence stretch the weight of it, pressing against the walls. Daniel's jaw twitched. Samantha's eyes darted between her mother and me, searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. Eleanor, oblivious to the storm she'd unleashed, continued kindly. "You must be so proud, Daniel, to have such an accomplished mother and to see your family's name carried with such distinction." It was almost merciful the way she said it. But mercy was the last thing her daughter wanted. Samantha's face was pale now, her smile tight and brittle. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Daniel's hand found hers under the table, a reflex maybe, or a plea for calm. It didn't help. Someone coughed near the back. Another person whispered my name. And then the fake father, the man they'd hired, the man still pretending to be my husband, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker there. Guilt, perhaps. Or shame. I almost pitied him. Almost. I turned back to Eleanor. "Thank you," I said. My voice was steady, almost too steady. "It's been a long journey, but I've been fortunate. My company has built a lot of what you see here tonight." There was a collective intake of breath, a murmur rising like a tide. Samantha stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "Mother," she said sharply, "maybe we should." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "Built this," she repeated, eyes widening. "You designed the venue." I smiled faintly. "Paid for it, too." That was when the room truly fell silent. The air thickened. You could have heard a pin drop between the gasps. Daniel looked at me as if seeing a stranger, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Samantha's lips parted, then pressed together again. The color in her cheeks drained until she was the same pale ivory as her gown. And me, I just stood there, calm and still, in the center of it all, feeling the shift, the invisible line between humiliation and power tilt in my favor for the first time. All around us, the illusion they had so carefully built began to crumble. Eleanor glanced between us, confusion dawning in her eyes as she tried to piece it together. "I don't understand," she said softly, looking from me to her daughter. You said, but she never finished the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew. Samantha lowered her gaze, her hands trembling. Daniel sat frozen, his face caught somewhere between shock and fear. The imposter quietly rose from his seat, as if realizing he no longer had a role to play. And me, I finally stopped pretending to be invisible. I had been quiet long enough. And that was when I stopped pretending too. The moment hung in the air like the pause between thunder and lightning, still heavy electric. I could feel every pair of eyes in that ballroom on me, 1,000 silent questions rippling through the crowd. Samantha's face was ghost white. Daniel sat frozen beside her, his hand still resting on hers like an anchor that had suddenly lost its weight. For the first time all night, I didn't look away. I didn't plan what I did next. There wasn't time for strategy or fear, only truth. I stepped forward, the sound of my heels cutting through the murmurs, and climbed the short set of stairs leading up to the stage. The master of ceremonies hesitated, unsure whether to stop me. I smiled politely as I took the microphone from his startled hands. "Thank you," I said softly. My voice carried easily across the room, calm and steady. "Before we continue with this beautiful evening, I'd like to take just a moment to express my gratitude to the person who made all of this possible." A rustle moved through the guests. Samantha blinked rapidly, her lips parting in alarm. Daniel began to rise, but I held up a hand. "It won't take long," I said. I turned slowly toward the audience. Tonight we're celebrating love commitment and the joining of two families. But we're also standing inside something more. Something built with care, dedication, and hard work. This extraordinary evening, every light, every flower, every glass of champagne exists because of one company's effort. I paused, letting the silence deepen until I could feel the tension tighten like a wire. Hughes Designs Group. My name echoed across the marble hall, sharp and clear. At first, there was only confusion. Guests turned to each other, murmuring. A few clapped politely, unsure. Then I continued my tone, gentle but unwavering. Many of you may not know, but Hughes Designs Group has spent the past several months planning and creating this event. Every arrangement, every table setting, every detail you see here tonight came through our team's hands. It was a project I was deeply proud of because it wasn't just for a client. It was for my son. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The sound of it filled the silence that followed. Samantha's mother, Eleanor, stared at me as if she were trying to reconcile two separate realities. Samantha's head was bowed, her knuckles white around her champagne glass. Daniel's lips moved soundless before he managed a hoarse, "Mom, please stop." But I didn't. Not this time. I reached into my small silver purse and drew out a folded set of documents, the contracts, invoices, payment confirmations. "I'd like to thank the vendors as well." I continued my tone, almost conversational, "for their professionalism and patience throughout this process, especially in processing the payments from my company, $650,000 in total." A camera flash went off near the back of the room, followed by another. Phones appeared in hands like magic. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. I unfolded one of the pages and held it up so the front rows could see. "Here's the signed contract," I said. "Rosewood Estate catering, floral arrangements, live music, decor, all handled through Hughes Designs Group. And every cent was billed directly through our corporate account." I turned toward Samantha then. She looked up, her expression tight, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I said truth has a way of showing up even when we try to bury it." Daniel stood, then his face pale, his composure unraveling. "Mom, please, this isn't the place." "No, Daniel," I said quietly. "This is exactly the place." The murmurs rose again, some sympathetic, others stunned. I saw Eleanor cover her mouth with one hand, eyes wide. The fake father, Robert Mason, had vanished from his seat, slipping quietly into the background like smoke. I glanced around the room at the glittering faces that had spent the evening smiling at lies. "I spent my life building something out of nothing," I said. "I built it with my hands, my sweat, my time, because I wanted my son to have a life better than mine. And tonight, I learned what that life cost me." The words came softer now, steadier. "Respect apparently isn't part of that price tag. But money that I've given plenty of." More cameras clicked. The ballroom had gone utterly still, except for the sound of my voice and the faint hum of the lights overhead. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, meeting the eyes of the guests in the front row, some uncomfortable, some transfixed. You see, I said this wedding wasn't paid for by a generous groom or a wealthy family. It wasn't financed by old money or new love. It was paid for by a woman who was told she should be proud to sit quietly at table 18 near the kitchen while a stranger was introduced as her husband and her own name erased. A few people gasped. Someone muttered, "My God!" Daniel's voice broke through, then desperate. "Mom, that's enough." I turned to him. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "It's finally just enough." The silence that followed was heavy, complete. You could feel it settling into the bones of the room, into the floor beneath us. Samantha had stopped breathing, or at least it seemed that way. Her hand shook where it rested on the tablecloth. Then slowly, deliberately, I reached into my purse again. One last envelope, thick, and folded the paper crisp against my fingers. I could feel the weight of it, the final proof, the final act. I looked down at Daniel, at Samantha, at the glittering, hollow world they had tried to build on the ashes of my dignity. And then I showed them the final check. The envelope in my hand felt heavier than paper should. It was more than just a piece of currency. It was everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, now distilled into a single symbol of what my son and his bride had traded for their pride. The room was utterly silent. You could hear the faint hum of the lights above us, the quiet, uncertain breaths of 300 people who didn't yet know whether they were witnessing a scandal or a reckoning. I looked down at Daniel and Samantha. Daniel's face was ashen, his lips parted in disbelief. Samantha's hand was pressed to her chest, her diamond ring catching the light as if mocking the moment. Her eyes darted toward her mother, desperate for help that wasn't coming. Eleanor sat still, her expression unreadable shock, confusion perhaps, a dawning realization that her daughter's perfect evening had turned to glass underfoot. I took a deep breath and unfolded the check with care, my fingers steady despite the trembling in my chest. "This," I said, my voice calm and even, "is the final payment for tonight. $340,000. It was due to clear first thing Monday morning. I lifted it so the guests could see the elegant signature gleaming under the lights. With this payment, every expense would be settled. The caterers, the photographers, the decorators, the musicians, everything. Someone near the back let out a low whistle. Cameras continued to flash. I could see the phones raised, recording, capturing every word, every breath. But I didn't care. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about truth. I turned the check slowly in my hands, feeling the thick, expensive paper between my fingers. I've spent my life learning that respect isn't given to women like me, it's earned inch by inch. I built Hughes Designs with nothing but my hands and my will. I thought I could buy a little happiness for my son tonight. I thought I could buy love, maybe even pride. I paused, looking directly at Daniel. But respect cannot be bought. Not even for $500,000. The words hung in the air. Then deliberately, I tore the check straight down the middle. The sound of it echoed in the vast hall like the snap of a tree in a storm. I didn't stop. I tore it again and again until the pieces fluttered from my hands like confetti. Gasps filled the room. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Somewhere in the crowd, a man whispered, "My God," but no one moved. I let the fragments fall to the polished floor and looked around at the sea of stunned faces. "You can buy flowers," I said quietly. "You can buy music and lights and applause. But you can't buy decency. You can't buy family. And you can't buy me." For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered once and went out. The music stopped mid-note. The quartet lowered their instruments in confusion. A murmur of panic rippled through the guests. The room, once glowing with gold and champagne and laughter, was swallowed in darkness. I heard chairs scrape glasses, clink, the faint shuffle of heels against marble. Someone called out for the coordinator, but she didn't answer. Then another sound, quiet but unmistakable. The kitchen doors swinging shut one last time. I realized slowly that the staff were leaving. Without that final payment, their contracts were void. The caterers, the decorators, the musicians, everyone who had made this night sparkle had stopped being paid the moment I tore that check in two. A single emergency light near the entrance flickered on, casting the room in pale shadows. Samantha's gown shimmered faintly in the dim glow. I could see her standing now, her face pale, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" she whispered. I didn't answer. Daniel rose beside her, but for once he had no words. His shoulders were slumped, his composure gone. He looked at me, not with anger this time, but with something closer to fear. Eleanor stood slowly, her hand gripping the back of her chair for balance. Around her, the guests were beginning to murmur again, louder now, uneasy. I heard one of them say, "Is this real?" Another whispered, "She paid for everything." The room was unraveling, the illusion of perfection collapsing piece by piece. I walked down from the stage, my steps unhurried. The hem of my navy dress brushed the fallen paper on the floor. The fragments of the check clung to the shine of my shoes. When I reached the main aisle, I turned once more toward the stage. Daniel and Samantha stood there frozen, caught in the fading light like actors at the end of a tragedy. I wanted to tell him I was sorry it had come to this, that I had never meant to destroy his wedding only to reclaim my name. But when I opened my mouth, no words came. The silence was enough. Somewhere near the door, a server dropped a tray. The crash rang through the hall, followed by a long, echoing stillness. In that darkness, I heard someone take a sharp breath. Then a whisper, soft, broken, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was Samantha. "Oh my God!" she said, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "Oh my God! What have we done?" Her words trembled through the silence like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Then all at once, the room broke open. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. The hush that had settled over the ballroom shattered into a wave of noise, confusion, anger, disbelief. Guests began to stand, murmuring to each other, their faces pale in the dim emergency light. Somewhere, a glass fell and burst into shards. The scent of spilled wine hung in the air, sharp and sweet, mixing with the fading aroma of the dinner that would never be served. I stood still at the center of it all, watching the world I had built for my son crumble like wet paper. Samantha covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Daniel stood beside her motionless, his gaze fixed on the torn fragments of the check, scattered across the floor. Around them, the carefully crafted illusion, the flowers, the chandeliers. The laughter died one detail at a time. Guests began to leave in clusters. Some moved quickly, eyes averted, unwilling to be part of the scandal. Others lingered whispering to one another, stealing glances at me as if I were both victim and spectacle. A woman in a red gown passed me muttering under her breath, "Unbelievable." Another stopped long enough to whisper, "I'm sorry," before hurrying away. And then came the sound I hadn't expected, the click and whir of camera shutters. At first, just one, then another. I turned toward the open doors of the ballroom and saw them, reporters drawn by the noise and the spectacle of a ruined wedding. Their flashbulbs flared like lightning as they snapped pictures of the debris, the frightened guests, the fallen perfection. I should have felt triumphant. For weeks, I had imagined what it might feel like to expose their lies, to see justice, if you could call it that, take form. But standing there under the harsh light of a dozen lenses, I didn't feel powerful. I felt hollow, tired. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't live in your bones, but in your soul. Eleanor sat at the head table, frozen in place. Her hand was still at her mouth, her eyes wide and glassy. I walked past her, and she reached out, catching my wrist lightly. You're Hugh's designs," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "You paid for all of this." I nodded once. She swallowed hard. "I praised you earlier," she whispered. "I told my daughter how lucky she was to be joining your family." She looked toward Samantha, who now sat slumped in her chair, surrounded by chaos. "And she treated you like—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I squeezed her hand gently. "It's not your fault," I said. "You couldn't have known." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "But I should have seen it. The arrogance, the lies. I raised my daughter better than this." Her voice broke and she turned away. I left her there, her pearls glinting faintly under the emergency light, her shoulders shaking with quiet disbelief. I walked slowly toward the center of the room where Daniel still stood. The guests were thinning now, the noise ebbing into a low hum of confusion and gossip. The reporters were being escorted out, their flashes fading down the hall. Only the faint echoes of their voices remained, the promise of tomorrow's headlines, already writing themselves in the air. Daniel looked up as I approached. His face was drawn, the confident young man from earlier replaced by a boy who looked utterly lost. "Mom," he said hoarsely. His voice cracked on the word. I stopped a few feet away, saying nothing. He swallowed hard, his throat working as if the words themselves hurt to speak. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. He trailed off, staring at the floor. "I thought if I could make them respect me, if they saw me as successful, they'd see you that way too." I didn't think I cut him off gently. "You didn't think I'd find out." He shook his head, eyes filling. "No, I didn't think you'd be here. Samantha said it would be easier if—" His voice faltered. "If they thought you were gone." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't look at him and still hold back the tide of emotion rising in my chest. When I opened them again, I saw my son, the boy who used to sit on the floor of my office building towers, out of fabric swatches and empty boxes, telling me he wanted to be like me one day. That boy was gone, buried beneath years of pride and shame. He stepped forward and did something I didn't expect. He dropped to his knees. Right there in the middle of the ruined ballroom, surrounded by wilting flowers and half-empty glasses, he knelt before me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Please, Mom. I'm so sorry." The sound of it broke something in me. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing his hair the way I had when he was small. For a moment, Neither of us spoke. There were no words big enough for what had been lost. I wanted to forgive him right then, to pull him up and tell him it would be all right. But forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something you could offer while the wound was still bleeding. It had to come later if it came at all. So instead, I said quietly, "You'll have to live with what you've done, Daniel. That's punishment enough." He bowed his head. The lights flickered once more, then went dark completely, leaving only the faint silver of moonlight through the tall windows. Somewhere behind us, I heard the last guests leaving their footsteps fading into the night. I stood over my son, my hand still trembling, my heart split between sorrow and pity. Around us, the wreckage of the evening lay in perfect, unbearable stillness. But the real punishment was still waiting. In the days that followed, the echoes of that night traveled farther than I could have imagined. The story spread faster than any of us could contain it. By morning, it was on the front page of every local paper in Napa CEO. Shock's wedding guests with $650,000 revelation. Photos of me on the stage holding the microphone, my face caught between grief and composure, were everywhere. The image became a symbol for something larger than a wedding gone wrong. People called it justice humiliation spectacle. They all had their versions. The venue sent an apology offering to refund what was left of the deposit, though I never asked for it. The staff who'd walked out that night told reporters that they had no idea what was happening. They thought the lights going out were part of the show. And maybe, in a way, they were. It was the final act of a story that had been unraveling long before the first glass of champagne was poured. Daniel and Samantha's faces appeared in headlines beside mine. His employer, Harrington Investments, issued a polite statement thanking him for his service and wishing him well. In reality, wishing him well meant severing ties quietly. Reputation was currency in his world, and his had just been spent. Samantha's name disappeared from the society pages entirely. The glamorous couple everyone had admired was now spoken of in whispers. I didn't hear from either of them in those first few weeks. Not a call, not a message, not even a headline quote of remorse. Silence stretched between us wide and heavy. I told myself I preferred it that way. I needed distance. I needed to breathe again. I left Napa 2 days after the wedding, driving north through the hills until the vineyards faded into open fields. The farther I went, the lighter I felt. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my assistant at Hughes Designs. I left her a note on my desk that simply said, "I'll be gone a while. Handle what you can and don't take calls from reporters." She'd understand. She always did. The drive was long and quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was enough. I passed through small towns, each one blurring into the next farm stands, diners, gas stations, places where no one recognized my name. That anonymity felt like air after being underwater too long. I stopped one night at a motel off the highway, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and the faint smell of rain in the carpet. I sat by the window watching the headlights pass and thought about how strange it felt to be both the victor and the casualty of the same battle. I had exposed the truth. I had reclaimed my name. And yet in doing so, I had watched my son's world fall apart. I told myself he'd chosen that path, that both he and Samantha had written their own ending. But when I closed my eyes, I still saw his face kneeling before me, broken, whispering apologies I couldn't yet accept. A week passed. Then 2. I returned home eventually, though home didn't feel the same. The quiet was different now. Before it had been peaceful. Now it felt like waiting. My office at Hughes Designs was exactly as I'd left it, organized, sterile, professional. On my desk sat a stack of unopened letters from event partners, journalists. even a few clients who wanted to express their admiration. I ignored them all. I spent my mornings tending to the small garden behind the house, a habit I'd picked up years ago to calm my mind after long workdays. The roses had begun to wilt, and I trimmed them back carefully, one stem at a time. It was soothing, the rhythm of pruning, of letting go what no longer served growth. The neighbors would stop by occasionally, offering awkward smiles and half-hearted sympathy. "We saw the news," one of them said. "You did what any mother would have done." I nodded, but didn't answer. I wasn't sure that was true. Any mother might have forgiven. I wasn't ready for that yet. Sometimes at night, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The quiet hills, the fading light, it reminded me of all the years I'd spent chasing something better for Daniel. The education I'd paid for the business I'd built to give him every opportunity I never had. And I wondered, when exactly love had turned into shame for him, when the son who used to kiss my cheek before school had decided his mother wasn't someone to be proud of, but someone to hide. Still, I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd done. The truth had been ugly, but it was clean. It was honest. And in the end, honesty was the only thing I had left. One evening, while watering the hydrangeas, I caught sight of my reflection in the kitchen window. I barely recognized the woman, looking back older, perhaps, but steadier. There was a peace in her eyes that hadn't been there in years. I realized then that I hadn't destroyed anything that night. I had simply stopped pretending. Later, when a reporter left a message on my machine asking whether I had any comment about the Hughes wedding scandal, I deleted it without hesitation. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The truth had spoken for itself. I remember what I said to the empty room that evening, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ruin their wedding," I said. "They ruined it themselves." 3 weeks later, he knocked on my door with a suitcase. At first, I thought I was imagining the sound. It was late afternoon, and the sky was painted with that soft orange haze that only comes before dusk. I had been in the kitchen rinsing teacups, letting the quiet fill the house as it had for weeks. When the knock came again, steady and hesitant, something inside me tightened. I dried my hands slowly, half hoping it was anyone else. A delivery, a neighbor, a mistake. But when I opened the door, there he was. Daniel. He stood on the porch, thinner than I remembered. His suit, wrinkled hair, unkempt dark circles under his eyes. In his hand was a small black suitcase, the kind he used to bring home from college visits. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other, the air thick with everything that hadn't been said. "Hi, Mom," he said finally, his voice low, cracked around the edges. I studied his face. He looked older, not in years, but in spirit. The arrogance, the polished charm he used to wear like armor, it was gone. In its place was a man stripped bare by his own choices. I stepped aside without a word, and he entered. He moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though he wasn't sure he was allowed. The house was silent, except for the creak of the floor beneath his shoes. He set the suitcase down near the couch, but didn't sit. I noticed the faint tremor in his hands. "Do you want some tea?" I asked. My voice came out calm, though my heart was pounding. He nodded. "Please." I made it the way he liked, honey instead of sugar, a slice of lemon on the side. When I handed him the cup, he stared at it for a long moment before setting it down untouched. "I've missed this place," he said quietly. "I used to think it was too small. Now it feels safe." I didn't respond. I sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap, waiting. I knew why he was here, but I needed him to say it. He took a deep breath and looked up at me. "I lost my job," he said simply. "They said they couldn't risk the reputation." He let out a humorless laugh. "Funny thing is, I thought reputation was all that mattered. Turns out it's the easiest thing to lose." I nodded slightly, but stayed silent. He rubbed his temples as if trying to steady himself. "Samantha's gone. She left 2 days after the wedding. Her mother helped her move back to San Diego. I tried calling, but she won't answer." I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The marriage had been doomed from the start, but hearing it confirmed still stung. He looked up at me then, and I saw the tears he was fighting. "Mom." "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything." His voice broke on that last word. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face. "I don't even know who I was anymore. I got so caught up trying to be someone they'd respect, someone who belonged in their world. I thought if I could just make them see me differently, they'd see you differently too." He looked up, eyes red. "But all I did was destroy everything that mattered." I took a breath, steadying my own trembling hands. "Daniel," I said softly, "you wanted them to respect you, but you lost the only person who truly did." He flinched like the words had hit him physically. Then he nodded slowly, tears spilling over now unchecked. "I know," he whispered. "I know, Mom. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't know where else to go." The sound of rain began softly against the window, a slow rhythm filling the silence between us. I wanted to stay cold to protect whatever strength I had left. But then I saw him, not the man who betrayed me, not the stranger who introduced me as a family friend, but the boy I once carried home after he fell from his bike knees, bloodied, crying into my shoulder. The boy who used to ask me if hard work always paid off, and the one who used to kiss my cheek goodnight without fail. "Where have you been staying?" I asked quietly. He shrugged. "A motel outside the city. I didn't have much left after—" He trailed off. "After everything." I nodded. The clock ticked softly behind us, filling the stillness. I knew what I had to do, even if my heart wasn't ready. "You can stay here," I said finally. He blinked, startled. "Are you sure?" "No," I said honestly. "But you're still my son." He looked down, his shoulders shaking as he whispered, "Thank you." That night after he'd gone to the guest room, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the rain, tracing lines down the glass. I could hear his suitcase unzipping drawers opening softly as he unpacked the little he had left. The house felt different now, heavier somehow. I wanted to believe that time could mend this, that love could survive what pride had broken. But forgiveness wasn't something I could give on command. It had to be earned piece by piece the way I'd built my life, with patience and pain. I turned off the light, listening to the rain fade into a whisper. Somewhere in the quiet, I prayed for both of us to find peace, to learn to heal. Forgiveness would take time, and I wasn't sure I had any left. The days that followed moved slowly, like a clock ticking underwater. Daniel and I lived in the same house, but spoke little. We shared meals in silence, both careful with our words, like people walking barefoot through glass. Sometimes I'd find him in the garden pruning the roses, a habit he must have picked up from watching me. Other times I'd wake to the faint sound of him moving through the kitchen in the early morning, making coffee he rarely drank. He was trying in his own quiet way. But forgiveness, as I'd told him, wasn't something you could rush. Then one morning in early spring, I opened the newspaper and saw her name again. Samantha Reynolds Hughes. The article was short. 3 paragraphs tucked between stories about stock markets and real estate trends. Fashion's fallen darling, it called her. After the wedding scandal, she had been quietly dropped by every brand she'd worked with. The lifestyle sponsorships vanished, the invitations stopped coming. She'd filed for divorce 2 months after the wedding, citing irreconcilable differences. The photo accompanying the piece was stark. No glamour, no perfect makeup, just a young woman staring down at her phone, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. I folded the paper and set it aside. There was no satisfaction in seeing her broken. Just a dull ache, the kind that comes when something you once hoped would bloom has withered beyond saving. Later that week, a car pulled into my driveway, a sleek black sedan I recognized from that night in Napa. When the door opened, Eleanor Reynolds stepped out. She was dressed in a simple gray coat and carried a small leather bag. She looked older, not in years, but in spirit, much like Daniel. Her usual poise was still there, but softer now, stripped of pretense. "Mrs. Reynolds," I greeted as I opened the door. She smiled faintly. "Please call me Eleanor. I think we've both earned the right to drop the formalities." We sat in the kitchen. I poured her tea, though neither of us seemed interested in drinking it. For a while, we spoke of small things, the weather, the garden, the vineyard road she'd driven down to get here. It wasn't until she set her cup down that her eyes met mine with a weight that silenced everything else. "I came to apologize," she said. "Not just for what my daughter did, but for what I didn't see." I raised her to value class, but somewhere along the way, she confused it with status. She paused, her voice softening. "You reminded me what real class looks like, Maggie. Standing on that stage, you had more grace in truth than any of us had in our illusions." Her words landed gently, but deeply. For the first time in a long while, I felt the sting of tears that weren't from anger or betrayal, but from something almost like gratitude. "I didn't do it to make a point," I said quietly. "I did it because I had to. Sometimes the only way to keep your name is to say it out loud." Eleanor nodded. "And you did?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a white envelope, thick and carefully sealed. "This is for you, or rather for your grandson, Charlie." I hesitated. "Charlie?" She smiled faintly. "My attorney helped me arrange it. It's a small transfer of company shares from Reynolds Interiors. Nothing life-changing, but enough to give him a foundation when he's older. A chance to build something honest." I stared at her, unsure what to say. "Eleanor, that's generous." "It's what's right," she replied simply. "Consider it my way of balancing the scales. My family took too much from yours. It's time we gave something back." I took the envelope, my fingers brushing the edge of the paper. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt too small for the moment. She smiled again, faint, but real. "You don't owe me thanks, Maggie. If anything, I owe you mine." When she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. The wind outside had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. She paused on the porch, her hand on the railing. "Samantha will have to face what she's done," she said softly. "I can't protect her from that anymore. But I hope one day she'll find the courage to do what you did, to tell the truth, even when it costs everything." After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning the envelope over in my hands. It wasn't the money or the gesture itself that moved me, it was the recognition. The quiet acknowledgement that dignity, though invisible, still had value in a world obsessed with appearances. I placed the envelope in the drawer beside Paul's old watch, where I kept the things that mattered most. For the first time in months, the house felt lighter. Daniel came home later that evening, and I told him about Eleanor's visit. He listened silently, then nodded with something like relief. Maybe she's not so different from you after all he said. I smiled. Maybe we've both learned the hard way that pride is the most expensive thing we own. We didn't talk about Samantha after that. There was nothing left to say. But then, months later, a letter came from Samantha. It arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, slipped between the bills and catalogs that usually filled my mailbox. The envelope was plain, the handwriting neat, but uncertain, as though each letter had been written with hesitation. I recognized her name immediately: Samantha Reynolds. For a long moment, I just stood by the window turning it over in my hands. There was no return address, only a postmark from a small town 2 hours south of Napa. I thought about throwing it away, but something in me couldn't. When I finally opened it, the paper inside was creased, the ink slightly smudged. "Mrs. Hughes," it began, "you're the last person I have any right to write to. But I don't know who else to turn to. I made choices I'll regret for the rest of my life. I was foolish, proud, and cruel. You didn't deserve what I did to you or to your son. I've lost almost everything now, except for my little boy. If there's any chance you could meet with me not to forgive me, but to let me prove I can be better, I would be grateful." The letter ended without a signature, just a single line at the bottom. "Please don't tell Daniel," I reached out. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside my cup of tea. I didn't know what I felt. Anger had burned out months ago, leaving behind something quieter, something that felt like understanding. Life has a way of teaching humility when pride won't listen. A week later, she showed up. It was early morning at Hughes Designs. The office was still filling with light, and my staff had just started arriving. I was reviewing client portfolios in my office when my assistant buzzed me. "There's a woman here to see you," she said. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." I hesitated before answering. "Send her in." When the door opened, I almost didn't recognize her. Samantha stood in the doorway wearing a faded coat, her hair pulled back simply, her face pale and thinner than I remembered. In her arms, she carried a little boy, no more than 3, who clung to her shoulder, his small hand gripping her collar. "Mrs. Hughes," she said quietly, "thank you for seeing me." I gestured for her to sit. She looked around the office, her eyes lingering on the framed design sketches along the walls, the sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor. "I didn't come here for pity," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I came for work." I folded my hands on the desk. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Any kind," she said quickly. "I'll clean answer phones, run errands. I just need something steady. My parents have stopped helping me, and I don't want my son growing up thinking we depend on anyone's charity." Her honesty surprised me. There was no trace of the arrogance she once carried like a second skin. Only exhaustion and a kind of quiet determination I hadn't seen before. "Does Daniel know you're here?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, and I'd rather he didn't." I studied her for a long moment. The little boy looked up at me with curious eyes, his features startlingly familiar. "What's his name?" I asked. "Charlie," she said softly. "After Daniel's grandfather." Something in my chest ached. I thought of the envelope Eleanor had given me months ago, the one sitting in my desk drawer. I thought of what forgiveness could look like when it wasn't spoken, but lived. "You can start next week," I said finally. "Administrative assistant part-time. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." She blinked as if she hadn't heard me right. "You'd hire me, I would," I said. "But there's one condition." She nodded quickly. "Anything. You'll report to my operations manager, not to me. He doesn't need to know your background, and neither does the rest of the staff. You'll be treated like any other employee." She lowered her head. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't let you down." And for the next few months, she didn't. She arrived early, stayed late, and never complained. She was polite, professional, and careful never to overstep. Sometimes I watched her from my office window as she helped new interns with invoices or stayed after hours to fix a filing error no one else wanted to touch. She was quieter now, humbler. Life had softened her edges, and in that humility, I saw the faint outlines of the woman she could have been all along. One evening, I was leaving late when I passed her at the copier. She didn't notice me at first. I heard her whisper softly to herself, "One more chance." That's all I needed. I smiled faintly and kept walking. 2 weeks later, she found out who I was. My assistant had mentioned my full name in front of her Margaret Hughes CEO and founder of Hughes Designs, and I saw the realization dawn in her face. She came into my office later that day, pale and shaking. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew who I was. You knew everything, and you still hired me." I closed my laptop and looked at her. "Everyone deserves the chance to rebuild," I said. "Even the ones who once tore things down." Her eyes filled with tears. "You had every right to destroy me," she said, her voice breaking. "But you didn't." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city beyond. "I've learned that destroying someone never builds anything," I said, "but grace that can rebuild entire worlds." When I turned back, she was crying silently, her shoulders trembling. And for the first time since that terrible night, I felt peace settle in the room, like sunlight after a storm. She wiped her eyes, then looked at me with a small, trembling smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mrs. Hughes." And that day, she finally called me Mrs. Hughes. It's been nearly 3 years since that morning. The world has softened around me again. The wounds, though deep, have closed into quiet scars, visible only if I choose to remember where they are. The company is steady. The house is calm. The garden, which once felt like a graveyard for my hopes, is now full. Again, roses, lavender, and sunflowers stretching toward the light. Life, it seems, insists on continuing, no matter how broken it gets. Daniel lives nearby now. After a long year of reflection and rebuilding, he found work at a smaller investment firm, not the glossy kind that once defined him, but honest work with people who value integrity over image. He married again last spring, a woman named Claire. She's gentle and grounded, a school teacher who wears simple dresses and laughs easily. Their ceremony was small, held in a chapel that fit barely 50 people. There were no chandeliers, no champagne towers, no photographers, just white flowers, quiet music, and vows spoken with trembling sincerity. I remember sitting in the second row watching Daniel slip the ring onto her finger. He looked different this time. Not the polished, anxious young man desperate to impress, but someone who had finally learned what mattered. Afterward, he found me in the garden behind the chapel. "Mom," he said, taking my hands in his. "I'm not asking you to forget everything I did. I just want you to know I understand now what dignity really means." I smiled at him, the kind of smile that comes after too many tears. "I know you do," I said. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. Samantha never returned to Napa. The last I heard, she'd taken a small apartment in Santa Cruz, working remotely for a design firm that hired her on merit, not connections. She sent an occasional update about Charlie, how he loved painting, how he'd started kindergarten, how he asked about his father sometimes. I wrote back only once a simple note wishing her peace. Some stories, I think, find their own quiet endings without us forcing them. As for me, I've learned to measure my life differently now. Not in headlines or contracts or even forgiveness, but in the small, ordinary things that survive after the storms. The smell of freshly baked bread on a Sunday morning, the creak of the porch swing as the sun sets, the laughter of my grandson running through the vineyard behind my house, his small feet kicking up dust as he chases butterflies between the vines. He calls me Grandma Maggie. I never correct him. The first time he did it, his voice soft and bright, I realized it was the sweetest version of my name I'd ever heard. Sometimes when he runs ahead of me, his hair catching the light, I think of how everything that once broke me somehow brought me here to this calm, golden hour where the world feels kind again. People sometimes ask if I ever regretted what happened in Napa. I tell them no. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because pain in its strange way was the teacher I needed. It stripped away everything false and left only what was real. Respect, love, dignity. I've come to understand that power isn't loud. It doesn't need a stage or a microphone. Power is the ability to stand still when the world demands you bow. It's choosing decency when you have every reason for revenge. It's the strength to walk away, knowing the truth doesn't need defending. It simply exists. Some people measure power in money. I measure it in dignity. This morning, as I sit on the porch watching Charlie race through the rows of vines, the air hums with the sound of bees and the faint laughter of children from the neighboring farm. The light is golden, spilling over the hills, soft and forgiving. I think about everything I've lost and everything I've found, and it feels balanced somehow, like the world has exhaled after holding its breath too long. Inside my desk is still neatly organized the habit of a lifetime. Contracts, invoices, correspondence. And in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old design drafts, there's an envelope I've kept for almost 2 years now. The handwriting is careful, unfamiliar, but I know exactly who it's from. Robert Mason, the man who once pretended to be my husband. The man who played his part so well that even I had to admire his conviction. His letter arrived after the scandal had died down, sealed in thick paper with a return address I never recognized. I never opened it. I've told myself it doesn't matter, that the past is better left untouched. But sometimes, in the quiet hours when the house is still, I find my hand reaching for that drawer, wondering what words might wait inside. Regret, apology, gratitude. Or perhaps something entirely different, an ending I haven't yet faced. The sun dips lower and Charlie's laughter echoes through the vineyard. I close my eyes, breathing in the warmth, the scent of earth and memory. My heart feels both heavy and light, as if it finally understands the strange symmetry of a life rebuilt from its own ruins. And yet, there's one letter I still haven't opened from the man who played my husband. And that's how it all came full circle. A story that began with pride and humiliation ended in quiet redemption and grace. Maggie didn't just rebuild her name, she rebuilt her heart, one truth at a time. Her journey reminds us that dignity can't be taken, it can only be surrendered. And when you choose to stand tall, no matter who tries to erase you, the world eventually sees you for who you truly are. Now, I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in Maggie's place, would you have done the same? Would you have exposed the truth that way or chosen forgiveness in silence? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them. If this story touched you, if it made you think about what family respect and strength really mean, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. There are more true-to-life dramas like this about love, betrayal, and the power of resilience coming soon. Thank you for listening, for feeling every word, and for being part of this journey. Until next time, remember, sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that last forever.